Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Hillary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with Joseph EWOODZIE Jr. presenting his new book, Getting Something to Eat in Jackson, Race, Class, and Food in the American South, joined in conversation by B. Brian Foster. Thank you for joining us tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, our event schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable the captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Getting Something to Eat in Jackson on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Joseph EWOODZIE Jr. is an associate professor of sociology at Davidson College. In his work, he uses qualitative research to examine how marginalized populations in urban locales make sense of inequalities in their everyday lives. He's also the author of Backbeat in the Bronx, Rediscovering Hip Hop's Early Years. Tonight, Professor EWOODZIE will be joined by B. Brian Foster, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia. He's the author of I Don't Like the Blues, Race, Place, and the Backbeat of Black Life, and is currently the co-editor of Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. They'll be discussing Professor EWOODZIE's latest book, Getting Something to Eat in Jackson, which Pulitzer Prize-winning author Matthew Desmond called an evocative and insightful book, going on to say that it is a memorable and lucid account of life and struggle, food and family in the modern American South. We're so happy to have them here tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Professor EWOODZIE and Professor Foster.
Pico, what's up, man? I'm ready. How you doing?
It's an honor and a privilege, man, to be doing this. Obviously, as the world is changing, we all wish we could be in person, but any time spent with you is time well spent.
Look, from a book about a book with Bronx in the title,
right, to
a book about Jackson, Mississippi.
Yeah.
Let's just go, right? Like how you get from the Bronx. I feel like you were spending some time in the Midwest, right? In Wisconsin. Like, how did you get to the city? How do you get to Jackson, Mississippi? How did this project, talk to us about how the project came about?
Yeah, so the first is like, how do I get to this physically in terms of the space? And is that, the story is actually with ABS, Association of Black Sociologists, has a conference in New Orleans. And I'm in graduate school, and I said, you know what? Let's drive down. Let me drive all the way down.
Wait, place us. What time? This is 20, what years?
This is 2010, maybe 2010, 2011, something like that.
Right.
So I'm driving down, and I don't really know the South, right? I'm just getting to know it. In graduate school, my roommate, Edward Cole, who's actually on the call right now. What's up, Cole? He's from Nashville. And so during homecomings, I'll just follow along and try to get to know the South, because you study race, you're interested in these kinds of things, you got to go to the South. So I drive to Jackson, and there's something really intriguing at the place. And no lie, I tell myself, I'm gonna come back to this place one day for something. But in terms of how do I get to this story theoretically, I'm in Wisconsin. I think it's my second year in graduate school. I come back from the library one night, and you need the moment of decompressing. So usually turn on the TV, you're watching a little Sports Center or whatever. But this particular night, I turned to BET, and there's a documentary on there. And the documentary is called Dying to Eat in Jackson, right? So my joke always is that I got my dissertation topic from watching BET, which is dope. Shouts to BET. And this documentary is
No,
exploring.
you didn't just shout out beats.
Right,
Okay, I'm
right.
sorry. Go.
It's exploring health concerns as it relates to food, right? We always think about the South as, you know, obesity is running rampant, diabetes, all these different things. And the documentary is doing a few things that I find really intriguing. It's speaking to health professionals about this topic, but more interestingly for me, and around the time my budding interest in ethnography, it's talking to regular people about their food decisions as well. And actually, when I get down there, I seek out some of the people that showed up in the documentary and talk to them. And the argument that they are making in this documentary is that the Black folks in Mississippi are, their decisions on what to eat is based on what their grandparents ate. And that's also based on what their grandparents ate. And so it's this, in my head, I'm sitting there and I'm like, this is a very uncritical regurgitation of cultural reproduction arguments. And that really stuck with me because that way of talking about a group of people was really familiar. Being from the African continent, it's very similar ways to how we think and talk about what's happening on the continent. I remember moving to the US when I was 13 and people are still asking like, are there cars? Are there roads? And so in their minds, a place like the African continent and a place like Mississippi feels stagnant, like it's not changing, like things aren't moving forward. And it always gets me back to the deep wisdom of Chimamanda Adichie's danger of a single story, right? We have a single story. And in fact, these people on the screens talking about their experiences are themselves regurgitating a very simple story about how people make decisions about what they eat. And so I remember that night thinking to myself, man, wouldn't it be great if somebody actually went down there, spent some time there, got to know folks there and try to make sense of how people are making decisions about what they eat today. Fast forward 3 years later, I'm having a conversation with my advisor, and it's, you know, the moment where you have the meeting with your advisor where you're trying to pitch your dissertation topics. I pitched the first 3 or 4 things. He just really wasn't feeling it. And then this idea sort of popped in my head. I'm like, well, there's this documentary that I saw about going to Jackson, and he immediately was super supportive of it. And so that's sort of what took me down there. And man, it's been such a growth and experience for me. It's a project that's given me so much, not just this book and this publication, but it endeared me to the South, and really, I grew a lot from doing this project.
So I want to, we'll get back to kind of some of the specifics of the content of the book, you know, in a little bit, but I want to, you know, you touched on, you kind of mentioned the ways that you know, Mississippi and the homeland, as it were, right? The continent are often read in these flat and singular and stagnant ways. Mm-hmm. And it kind of makes me think about, you know, and this ain't about my book or about, you know, me, but it makes me think about some of my own motivations, and some of the kind of disciplinary in sociology, disciplinary debates that way back when, around the same time, I started at Chapel Hill in 2011, and you know, around the same time, I'm being met with, in different contexts. It wasn't no documentary on BET, but in different ways, being met with this same sensation of, oh, okay, so no matter where I look, no matter where I read, got all these sociologists doing work in the South in the early, you know, 20th century, and then, you know, thinking about the kind of trajectory of studying the South and the discipline. No matter where I read, no matter where I listen, I hear these same tired ass, uncritical ass, or otherwise flat, one-dimensional depictions, accounts of the South. This is kind of, you know, I guess I'll ask you, the region, the South, the people of the region, communities in the South, especially Black folks in the South, have been A thing that I say is like the discipline has been fumbling with the South
Right.
or trying to fumble with the South, understand
Right.
the region for a while, for a long time, 100
Right.
years, more than 100 years.
Right.
And you know, with some exceptions, there are ebbs and flows. Long-winded question, but I just, you know, here we are, you know,
Yep.
I've got a book, Mississippi.
Yep.
You've got a book, Mississippi. There obviously other folks, you know, in the discipline and outside of the discipline, writing about the state, writing about the region. Why? Like, why? I wonder if you could talk more about why,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
that journey down to Jackson.
Yeah.
You know, why it was so resonant for you, and
Yeah.
and the work that has come out of it.
Yep.
Like, why is that important?
Yeah. So this takes another journey, right? So like, you know, I think this is a different answer to the first question, like, how did you get to Mississippi? And I think we're also getting to Mississippi at a very particular time. And so I'm going to try to quickly run through some of this.
Yep.
So some of the earliest sociological writings are about the South. They're about the nation's response to slavery. Slavery has always been the question of this country. And the history of this country always has to be written with trying to understand slavery. And since the Negro problem, as it was called, at the times of slavery, during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, and on and on and on, that question has always been a national conversation. So most social scientific writings about the South has also been, in some ways, writings about the nation. And for us as American sociologists, and some of the early classics, including ones that are only recently being considered classics, are about the South. Anna Julia Cooper, A Voice from the South, 1892. Ida B. Wells, Southern Horrors, 1892. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, 1935. We keep going and going and going. So, right. So the classics about American sociology, things that we got to celebrate, that we're still finding ways to celebrate, are about the South. So during those times, sociological writings were about the South and were about these national conversations. This is what Larry Griffin calls sociology in the South, because we're trying to understand this. But at some point, the South's role in illuminating national conversations changed. When millions of Black folks migrated up north, the Negro problem, which was still a national problem, was no longer a Southern problem. Those problems were no longer just set in Greensboro and Birmingham or Columbia. They were also now set in New York and St. Louis and Denver. So during these times, writings about the South were just about understandings of the South, right? When the Negro problem moves from the South to the North, sociologists were still writing. And in fact, your department is one of these great places where during these times, sociologists were writing a great deal. But around the time, they were just trying to make sense of the South as a region, right? Sociology of the South just became about the South and no longer about these national conversations. And I think where we are now is that there is this moment where writings about the South is now also, again, writings about the nation. For a whole bunch of reasons, this alignment about writing about the South and writing about the nation has come back. And it's doing so because some of the most pressing national problems are playing out in the South, or are old, unresolved national contradictions with deep roots in the South. So voter ID legislation, that takes all the way back to voter rights in the South. The importance of the Southern vote, right? Think of Georgia and the US Senate runoff. Abortion laws in Alabama and Texas are now, when you talk about abortion, you have to talk about what's happening in these Southern states. In North Carolina, HB2 got all of us thinking and talking about trans issues in ways that perhaps would not have been as big of a national conversation. Police brutality recalls other government-sanctioned torture and lynchings of Black bodies. You can't talk about police shootings without thinking about those moments. And also the causes and deepening of economic inequality, especially including wealth inequality, recalls slavery. It recalls New Deal policies that were mostly engineered by Southern Democrats. So that's where we're at. And this book comes in the world. Your book comes in the world. The books of so many other folks come, especially around this time when you're talking about American problems, you also now have to talk about the South. And when you're talking about the South, you're also talking about American problems.
That's a thing that I say often, right? Like that's a really beautifully done kind of disciplinary history
Sure.
of the relationship between right sociological inquiry and the American South. And the thing I say is that like folks doing work in and or of the South, they always been writing about the nation. Like it's always been like the South has always been this microcosm of, not just everything wrong or hampered about this place, but also some of the solutions too. We have since 2016, right, been, the Trump moment was so alarming to so many people. How can we live and make life in a place that's run by, all of fill in the blank, all of the ways that we have described this person? Go talk to the folks in Mississippi. Go talk to some of the folks in some of them counties in the Delta about how you make a life in the shadow of a bigot, in the shadow of someone who don't just like dislike you, but like don't see you as human, don't want you to, so forth and so on. So I kind of want to. I could go on and on.
But let me hit that real quick. So part of what's interesting here, though, is that like, I mean, I think about folks in your department, right? Odom, John Shelton Reed. These folks, there were moments where they were writing about the South. And there's this thing that happens in Southern studies too, right? Where there's an obsession with just thinking about the South in a very narrow regional sense, where it's not thinking and talking about a lot of different things. And I think a lot of all of this has to do with the, believe it or not, the still trying to reconcile the end of the Civil War and try to figure out, we're going to make a new South. The idea of there's every few years, there's this whole new mantra of like a new South. And now we call it the Nuevo South because, there are Latinos in the South now, right? Like, and so there's a little bit of that too. And I think what this moment is really saying is that like, look, we stop all of that. Let's just stop all of that and say, when we're thinking and talking about the South in the sense that you're talking about, we're talking about these United States, and whatever fight we're going to have, it has to be, if it's not resolved in the South, is not going to be resolved in the US. I honestly didn't go into this knowing that. I didn't go into this project understanding that already. And that's one of the pieces of education I've gotten out of it. And frankly, this is, a moment where I'll shout out to teaching at a small liberal arts school. I created a course called Sociology of the South when I was writing this book, and it forced me to read all of this stuff that really helped me understand this.
So one thing or a couple of things that do, and probably, even in those years where empirical interest in the region kind of wanes, there's some things that have kind of always been at the forefront of folks' mind, right? When they think about the South, they think about, perhaps music, blues.
That's it.
Other genres, kind of more contemporary Southern hip hop.
Yeah.
Which there's that essay, Darren Grimm, from earlier in the 2000s. Obviously, folks like Regina Bradley, Xander Robinson, really making the point that hip hop, the landscape today, like Southern hip hop and hip hop, is like kind of it's the same thing.
Yeah. Right.
Music,
so even we can think about that right now, right? Like it's the sound of Southern. I was listening to, we're going to different global, the global citizenship concerts. We were watching that at home, and we were listening to these MCs from Rio. I don't understand what they're saying, but they sound like Migos. I can tell you that, because they sound like Southern MCs, Southern rappers, right? So I think we're in this moment where what's happening in the South is front and center, and you just can't not pay attention to it.
And like it's interesting for me to see how, like, even as the sound and shape of rap like has changed, the South continues to be front and center, and in a lot of cases, kind of classic Southern hip hop, which is a funny thing to say, but late 90s, early 2000s hip hop, that trap sound has reemerged. I don't know, that might not even be the right kind of right way to put it. But so similar to the way that Southern music, right, has always been this darling, or always been this source of interest and intrigue in the kind of in national consciousness. So too has Southern foodways.
Yeah.
And you know, I wonder. So I'll just ask it. You know, a lot of people gonna call this a food book.
Right.
Oh, you wrote a food book.
Right.
You know, the my book, I Don't Like the Blues. Oh, you wrote a blues book. You wrote a music book. I don't. You know, I get it. I understand. You know, we look for easy ways to categorize and maybe remember things. I wrote a music book, and that you know, I bristle. It's
Right.
you know, I try to do it in a way that is you know, I try not to like cut people down. Like I ain't writing no more. But you know, but anytime that comes up, I do address it because it's not just a music book. I wonder. I haven't heard, you know, your perspective on this. And I don't know if this thing has happened to you yet. It will. They're gonna be like, you wrote a music book, or is this or food book? Is this a food book, or like how are you thinking about that? Like that way of framing this work?
Yeah. Man, so many different ways to answer that question. So I went into this. So my first project was about hip hop. And so when I was working on that book, I had this deep insecurity that and I was around at Wisconsin, I was around folks, Charles Hughes, shout out to Charles Hughes. I was around these folks who were just brilliant. They just knew musical history like there's nothing, you know, one of my other good friends is on here, Camille Rogers, knows more about music than I do. And so I was always afraid of I'm an imposter. And so that book is about the history of hip hop, but it's also a bunch about other things. I actually got more nervous in that sense here, writing about food, because I also don't actually know a whole lot about food. I'm a sociologist, I'm a cultural sociologist. And so I'm always trying to use different culture to understand different things. So I used the creation of hip hop to understand the experience of this cohort of Black and brown teens in the South Bronx who responded to urban decay with the creation of hip hop.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In the same way, I'm entering this work trying to understand. This book is an intraracial analysis of Black life that happens to use food. So this book is really first.
Let me jump.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Intraracial. What did that mean? I know we with the good folks at the Harvard bookstore.
Everybody
knows what you're talking about. But
so,
what you talking intraracial?
Yeah, it just means one. You know, I want to talk about Black folks. Like I've always wanted to talk about Black folks, and I want to talk about Black folks across class. Right. I want to see, and this is something that we actually used to do all the time. When we wrote about Black folks, we wrote about Black folks up and down the social economic ladder. It's another way of unflattening a story. It's another way of getting away from the danger of a single story. You pick up any ethnography book about Blackness, and it's most of the time, 80% of the time, is going to be about poor Black folks. 15-20% of the time is going to be about rich Black folks, or maybe about our kind of people, or maybe it's going to be about middle-class Black folks. There's actually very few books recently that's about Black folks up and down the social economic ladder. But
and not only that, it's it's about poor Black folks who are always and only and will forever be poor, or it's about middle class, or the question of mobility.
That's right.
You know,
exactly.
is often
Exactly. Right. But you know, some of my favorite sociology works are the ones that went Philadelphia Negro, starts from the bottom, goes all the way, and Drake and Caton, Black Metropolis, right? It's dealing with these different class groups. And so it's actually when your mentor writes This Ain't Chicago, and what she's doing, Zandria Robinson, right, who's influenced a whole generation of scholars.
The God.
What she's doing now is to say, you know what? Can we not have every ethnography about Black people be set in Chicago or New York or whatever? Can it be set somewhere else, right? So that's the first thing. And B, can we look at Black folks up and down the social economic ladder? So that's what this is. Now, because of the documentary, my this is a pun that my editor, shout out to Megan Levinson, who got me away from so many. My entree into their lives was through food. Right. And so that's what I was trying to do. This book is about that. I've gotten so much love from food studies people, including the good folks at the SFA, for this work that I'm a little shy rejecting that this is a food book, but this isn't a food book, right? It's a book that uses food to make a whole bunch of arguments. And I think we need to return to thinking about Black folks up and down the social economic ladder. We learn more about ourselves. We appreciate ourselves more. We also learn about how the world is working for some of us and how the world isn't working for some of us. We learn about how we participate in our own, how we in some ways participate in the oppressions of Black folks if we look at things across class. We learn about the different ways that racism is rearing its head and then making it work, right? So the experiences of the kid who doesn't go to college and the experience of the Black kid who doesn't go to college and the experience of the Black kid who does go to college. Looking at both of these kids allows us to understand how white supremacy is reinterpreting itself in today's lives. So more than anything, this book is about that.
I love the first line. I was just pulling it up. I love the first line. So to kind of tie it to this next point and question to I guess the previous question, like you start with the first word that we get is somebody's name. Like we start with a person. And this is a simple way to, and I often say this, and I know it's simplistic, but it's like, I ain't writing no music book. I wrote a book about Black folks in the Mississippi Delta.
That's right.
And what they are experiencing and how they feel about it. Is a funny thing is that like they have these complex and layered feelings about their conditions. And you do a similar thing. Or it's a similar dynamic where, it's a people book. And I wonder, one thing that I love the most when I'm talking about my work is when I'm able to talk about the folks that I spent so much time with and who opened their lives, right? Like literally, figuratively, in all of the ways. I wonder if, I know we could talk for the rest of our time here and the rest of the night and tomorrow about the folks that you met, but I wonder if you got a story, or if there may be one or two folks that you think kind of help crystallize some of the arguments, some of the points that you make in the work.
And I think this little bit that I'm about to read really does sort of emphasize this very last point that I made. So to set the scene a little bit, I'm at Lumpkin's Barbecue in South Jackson, right? I am at the moment volunteering as a dishwasher and sweeping the floors because I'm just trying to get in. And so Miss Monique and Mr. Melvin own this barbecue restaurant. They are from Washington, D.C. They relocated to the South to start this barbecue restaurant. And on this particular day, I cut you off? I know. How long had you been in Jackson when you meet these folks? So at this time, and maybe when in the Q&A, maybe I'm happy to talk about how I structured the study and how I did the time. So this is all 2012, and this is probably May or June, right? So end of the day, the customers are leaving. It wasn't a particularly strong day in terms of customers. And so they're thinking and talking about, well, why are our numbers going down? And it folds into this conversation about food and what it is that they're serving. And it sort of goes like this. So in their discussion, I began to hear differences, real or imagined, between how they think about food and how some of their potential customers think about food. It was a window into what I call their food consciousness. And their comments illuminated how they imagine their classed racial selves in the community where they live and work. So Miss Monique says, if you don't have greens and cornbread, people get mad. Yeah, but you do have greens and cornbread, I retorted. We have them, but we don't want to have them, they both responded. Mr. Melvin and Miss Monique responded in unison. Eventually, Miss Monique continues, we don't want to have greens. We want to do sandwiches and fries. That's what I want. They had earlier hinted how much they disliked being thought of as a soul food restaurant. I wanted to clarify what they meant. If you say soul food, you have to have greens and cornbread. I began, but they separately jumped in to finish my sentence. And if you don't, they'll just start laughing at you. They'll start talking shit and walk out of the door, Mr. Melvin mumbled under his breath, doing his best to allow his wife to give a fuller answer. People would also expect you to have, and this is Miss Monique continuing, they would expect you to have mac and cheese and candied yams like Sunday, like Big Mama, like she kept editing herself, but in her unfinished phrasings, I heard her trying to conjure up that old image of the Black matriarch cooking a large meal for her large extended family. Like what you think of traditional Southern cooking on a Sunday. And if you don't have every single thing, Black people will walk out. Mr. Melvin jumped in again. Plus, everybody think they can cook soul food. So people are always comparing this to what their memory of or genetic expectation is. So the achievement level is very high. Miss Monique's choice of word, genetic, was perhaps metaphoric. I took it to mean that she was referring to some hard to reach level of imagined authenticity. You can't get there because everybody's different, Mr. Melvin added. Instead of soul food, Miss Monique and Mr. Melvin wanted to be a barbecue place. When I asked them how they dealt with the expectations that people bring to a barbecue restaurant, they provided two different answers. The first was that, technically speaking, people can't barbecue in their homes, at least not the kind they can make at the restaurants. Most people can grill their meat, but they do not have the equipment to cook meat over indirect heat the same way they are able to do in their smoker. Second, Ms. Monique explained, people have a different expectation when it comes to barbecue. People are a little more forgiving. They're willing to try something new. Customers have a more definite idea of what they want soul food to be than they do of what they want barbecue to be. And their big smoker, she argues, allows them to make their barbecue the same way each time. Implicit in all of their comments was their frustration that richer white folks who lived across town were more interested in their food than the poor Black folks who lived near their restaurant. My mind lingered on the conversation I had with Miss Monique and Mr. Melvin as I pulled out of their restaurant parking lot at the end of the day. My mind kept trying to make sense of their attitude towards soul food. It could be read as a rejection of the South, a snobbish Black return migrant attitude buried under their seemingly amicable feelings toward being back in the region. Even if Alfred Opie, a food historian, soul food was the, quote, high cuisine of bourgeoisie African Americans, it had come to represent something in and about Blackness in the impoverished South. Because I had spent time with folks who lived in poverty, in their kitchens, around their dinner tables, I knew that poor Black Southerners today were not regularly eating soul food. Still, soul food was celebrated food, a symbol of something, survival, maybe, for being Black and poor and Southern. The Black people who walk out of Lumpkins in anger might have been disappointed that the restaurant did not have what they wanted to eat. They might have been upset also because they viewed Lumpkins and its Black proprietors to be, however implicitly, rejecting soul food and the symbolisms it evoked. Even though the restaurant was physically close to them, it felt socially distant from them. Their lives in poverty precluded them from experiencing and acquiring the taste to enjoy what Mr. Melvin and Miss Monique wished to offer. They did not have the luxury of an expanded food consciousness, the luxury to try new things and broaden their taste of good food, whatever that might be. Like other poor Black folks that had been around, they were too busy directing all their time and resources to pressing daily problems. When they came to Lumpkins, they wanted what they wanted. They wanted what they knew and liked, and they walked out upset because they wished Mr. Melvin and Miss Monique understood that. So what to them, Mr. Melvin and Miss Monique, these return lower middle class Black folks, could soul food actually mean? And how do their meanings of soul food differ from that of Black folks in poverty? Answering this question, especially by comparing the foodways of Black people across class, is one of the advantages of my tiered research approach. Mr. Melvin and Miss Monique may appreciate the symbolic significance of soul food to Southern Blackness. After all, they had deep roots in the South and now call it home. But to them, there was more to good food than soul food. The aspiration for creating other kinds of good food was not necessarily a rejection of soul food, much in the same ways that aspirations for upward mobility was not a rejection of Blackness and an aspiration for whiteness. For them, Lumpkins was a place that sought to add to the foods that were available to Black folks in Jackson. Perhaps unconsciously, they imagined their restaurant for people like themselves, those whose food choices are not defined only by availability, those who have the mental space for entertaining other influences, those who did not live in poverty. It included middle-class folks of all backgrounds, like the white folks from Rankin County who come for the ribs. But they wanted it to be for Black people like themselves, and like Charles, another middle-class Black client, or like me, a PhD student. It was a way for them to live out their expanded class taste, their expanded class background. They wanted it to be a symbol of the Southern Black middle class. Unfortunately, their restaurant was not in the right location. To have been more profitable, it needed to have been in another part of town, in a place with more people who had the luxury of trying and learning new taste. And unfortunately, precisely because they are Black middle class, and precisely because they don't have as much wealth as their white counterparts, Mr. Melvin and Miss Monique did not have the wealth to afford a restaurant in another part of town.
Wow.
So maybe we talk about that a little bit.
I wonder, so I mean, one thing that I appreciate about the book is that, like, while you deal with, from my perspective, like a tricky and difficult, like a part of what you deal with is a very tricky and difficult, like it's tricky and difficult territory. This question of food choice and Black folks and things like soul food in Mississippi, the South. And what I appreciate about the book is that you can never go too far. Like when we get this story or we get some commentary from you about choice, so you can never go too far before you also hear about constraints, like all of the, like this kind of matrix of material, symbolic, like all of these different factors that shape and impact the terrain that people are navigating in their day-to-day lives. So yes, let's stay here. I wonder if we've got a little bit of time. I got a few questions that I think we'll be able to fold into, like merge actually well with the other couple of questions that I have in mind. But yes, let's stay here. I wonder if there's another, I don't know if you I know you haven't really planned on reading anymore, but I just wonder if you could rap about another person or another kind of scene or another story, another interaction that when we consider it alongside the story of Lumpkins, like it might actually be synergistic and like kind of helping us see these stories and ideas the way that you do. Like, are there other folks? Is there another story that you might?
Absolutely. And so the book actually crescendos into thinking about Blackness in the upper middle class, right? To be Black and wealthy. And the way it does is that I end up following this guy who's running for mayor, 35 years old. He's not white people rich, but he's doing all right. He's rich, right? And I'm like volunteering as his what you call him, taking photos for him and helping him in his campaign. And the whole spiel is, and the last chapter of the book actually ends up not being about food at all. This is why this book really, in some ways, is not about food. It's about his campaign. And he, spoiler alert, he loses the campaign precisely because his opponents make this pitch that this man is rich and therefore not Black enough to serve folks, right? And so it becomes the best evidence or exploration for this clash between one's racial background and one's class background. for all of the book, I illustrate this argument with food. And then when I get to the very last chapter of the book, right, Running for Jackson, I say, let's take a step back from food and see that this actually is playing out in a whole bunch of other arenas. And I think anywhere, anywhere you gather enough Black folks, there's going to be this conversation where the epitome of Blackness becomes, and that's why, the argument is it builds slowly, but the epitome of Blackness becomes those who are in poverty. There are a larger proportions of Black folks in poverty. But if that comes to define what it means to be Black, and if we don't study other sort of Blackness in other portions of the social economic ladder, I think we miss a lot. And so that's another space where that comes to be. And, another example is this guy who wants to be vegan in Jackson, Mississippi. How do you do that? He's a big Black dude. So I follow him around where we're, trying out tofu and quinoa and all this kind of stuff. And I'm around a bunch of Black upper middle class folks, lawyers and journalists. They go to fancy restaurants, fine dining restaurants. Well, how do you live out your Blackness in fine dining restaurants that are notorious for not having Black clientele? How does that happen? And because of the fine dining restaurant, I go and I volunteer in the back kitchen. So from the behind the kitchens, I also see how fine dining restaurants are thinking about clientele that are not white, and how that comes to be. And so I got to see it in a lot of different angles, and really helped me tell the story.
This is a masterful ethnography. Like from a methodological perspective, you've dropped little nuggets throughout. I know you worked at the barbecue joint, right?
Yeah.
Worked at the barbecue joint. You volunteered for the mayor. You said you volunteered back in the kitchen at the. One of the questions is about the challenges of writing an ethnography that crosses classes, and so
Sure.
this is getting kind of to the.
Yeah.
And maybe you can weave, that crosses classes part into the answer. But I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about like what you did. You did something that's hard to do, right? Like real quick, like why don't we see more like ethnographic work in rural contexts in the South? Because it's hard to do.
Yeah.
Hard to do.
To answer that question, I'll tell you a little bit about how I ordered the study. So I show up in January. I barely know, I don't know anybody in Jackson. The only people, my point person, are the people who showed up in the documentary. So I'm showing up with the list of these folks and I'm going after them, trying to find them, right? And slowly I'm like, look, I know that the best way I'm going to tell the stories, at some point, I have to show up in somebody's kitchen, around somebody's dinner table, spend enough time around them to be able to make this thing happen. But the one place that I can go that I don't really need invitation or anything is the soup kitchen. So that's when I started my research there. I started spending time with folks who are homeless. I spent 3.5 months on the streets with people who are homeless. I have my own apartment, so I sleep in the shelters only a couple of times, but I spent all my waking hours with people who are homeless. So I did that. And so the structure of the study is like, while I spent 75% of my time with one class group, I spent 25% of my other time building connections for the other class group. So around March, April, I had built enough contact to transition to the next class group. And so I meet this young mother, and they're a set of sisters. They're unemployed, underemployed, welfare offices, dealing with kids, eviction, the whole nine. And then I meet this grandmother through another contact. She has 2 jobs, taking care of her grandkids, bus driver, and I'm spending all of my time. So that's another 3 months. So that 3 months with folks who are in poverty, keeping tabs with people who are homeless, and also finding ways to build contacts with people who are in the next group and the next group, because my aspiration is to 4 class groups. So then I move up again. That's when Lumpkins and the barbecue restaurant come in. They become my lower middle class folks. 75% of my time with them, and the rest of the time keeping tabs with the people that I just met and aspiring to move. And then the next class group is this mayor guy, this lawyer, this journalist. And so it's slowly climbing the social economic ladder while keeping tabs with people everywhere. So a couple of the challenges. One is that it's a different methodological strategy to get in with people. So for the homeless folks, you just got to show up. These are people who are consistently ignored. And it's Mississippi. They got stories for days. So if you're willing to sit and listen to them just talk about their lives for 12 hours a day, you're in. For those in poverty, I got a car. Jackson doesn't have good public transportation. They need to get to the welfare office and get to this. And so there becomes this weird transaction thing where precisely because of the economic circumstances, there are certain things that they don't have. And if you are able to help them out a little bit, they can sort of, and so helping people with resumes and helping them interpret things. And so with each class groups, it's a different strategy. It's hard as heck. The process of getting in for every ethnographer takes up so much of the time. And I was there for, 11 months in 2012 and 3 months in 2016. And I spent a ton of my time building relationships, and that took up so much of my time. And so that's part of the reason why a lot of folks don't do it. And it's hard.
There was a moment, during my work in the Delta, where I was having this conversation with, and this is like so the question I'm building up to is like, was there a kind of fork in the road moment? I know that there were many, but I wonder if there was a moment where you came to see the project in a different way. Maybe it's like a surprising moment. This is kind of getting at one of the questions. What was there something or someone that took you by surprise?
Mm-hmm.
And so like that's kind of the spirit of the question, but I'm kind of broadening it a little bit. I'm having a conversation with a guy, and this is my first conversation with him. But like he knew that I had been around, like, and
Sure.
He actually makes a comment very early in the conversation. It's like, oh yeah, you've been running around with them folks. You've been hanging with them, and it was a very hard like them, us, or like, and his sort of bottom line was, yeah, like, if you want the real story, this is language that he uses. If you want the real story, like,
come over here.
I'm sure they treat you well.
Yeah.
But you let me know when you want the real story.
Right.
I'll show you the folks that you need to talk to. And I followed this lead.
Sure.
And it was just like a different world for me. I wonder if there was a moment, maybe it's a completely different set of dynamics, right? So maybe it's not somebody saying, let me show you the way. But is there or I mean, was there something that surprised you? Was there something that or something super challenging? Like, I'm just interested in like these inflection points that inevitably come, with ethnographic work.
Sure. That's a tough question. There's quite a bit of them. And so I'm thinking about, so there's one moment that sticks out, and it doesn't make it into the book because I was always trying to figure out, what do I do? So the general overarching thing is that my first 3 months were actually really, really hard because you're spending time with people in extreme, like, in the book I say there's the underclass that we associate most Black folks in Mississippi with. But folks and then there are the people who are under the underclass. That's people who are living in homelessness. And so there were moments where I'm just like, I would go back to my apartment every day and ask myself, what am I doing? What am I doing this for? And my advisor at Wisconsin at the moment is like, look, we didn't send you down there to study homelessness. So what are you doing? Right. And part of it was just constantly trying to think about that. And that's when I dedicated myself more fully to saying, let me get their stories right. If my theoretical arguments don't hit, if my sociological stuff doesn't really become that important, what I will commit myself to doing is to make sure that the stories of these people who are walking these streets become part of the record of human history. And I'm going to fight like hell to make sure I get their stories right, write them well. And so that's part of also how I, you and I have talked a ton about writing and why writing is really, really important, and writing out works in the way that we do. And so that was one of those moments that really, being by myself and trying to think about, I think it was also one of those moments where I'm in Jackson. I got rejected from the Ford Foundation. I have no funding. So I'm like down and out for real, like in a crazy sense. All my expenses are being swiped through a credit card. And so like, I'm just like, what am I doing? But I think every ethnographer has those moments, and every project has part of that. And so that's what I would say, just like really unsure of what this is going to become. And a lot of the times you don't know until you're sitting back and writing it. And so communing with you when you were doing your project was one of the, the great joys of this project. And so the uncertainty of what you're doing a lot of the times is enough to make you stop. So I would say that.
We got 8 minutes, and
Yeah.
we got to talk about right now. Like,
Yeah.
you didn't you didn't push me there. I haven't read a whole lot of sociology. Hadn't read a whole lot of social science research that feels and is resonant in a way that getting something to eat is. And this is another thing we could talk about forever. I'll pose the question super generally, and you go where you want to. I wonder, like, if you could just talk about your approach, or maybe your intentions, if that's the way to put it. I wonder if you could talk about what must be an intentionality around style and aesthetics. And we got 7 minutes and a few other questions. We mostly hit on the questions, but if we have some time, I'll come back to.
I'll say this fairly quickly. One, as we're coming to find out, there's a lot of problems with the Chicago School Sociology canon, right? That we canonize it. They did a lot of things wrong. But one of the things that Robert Park made his students do well was just take the world and put it down. I mean, there are books where there isn't much analysis. You take a book of the book called Jack Roller, where it's just somebody comes out of jail, you sit, you interview them, you just write the story down, you write it as precise as possible. That was one influence. Another influence is being in graduate school and really being unsure of myself, and lucky enough to land this advisor who once told me this thing where my advisors, he says things always sometimes with the best of intentions, but it's a little quirky sometimes, and it takes you a moment for you to settle in. And he says to me, when you try to sound like other sociologists, you don't sound as smart. But when you sound like yourself, you sound very smart. And he probably will never remember saying that to me, but I took that very seriously to say, okay, if I'm in graduate school and I'm trying to sound smart like all these white folks, and that's not working, and this dude is telling me that's when I remember at that moment too, and writing the first book where I'm like, okay, let me just really dedicate myself to hone in the language skill that I know how to do best. That's another one. Matt Desmond's book comes out.
Yeah, Evicted.
It splashes everywhere, right? So, if you're, J. Cole and Blueprint comes out and is working, you're like, oh, that's where we going. Let's tell stories. Let's make it happen. That happens. And then, to be honest, bro, like, I'm out the country writing this book. You write to me out of the blue to say, yo, I'm finishing this book. You take a look. And I opened the book and it's like, this dude is trying to even be more lyrical and literature than I ever can be. And so that also gave me the confidence to say, if this is the lane that we're going to be in, let's be in it and really do it to the hilt. And then the final thing I say is that I want to write a book that my dad will want to read and talk about. I want to write a book that my peers who are engineers and pharmacy and whatever, they might read and say, yo, this is interesting. I want to write a book that my students can look at and enjoy too. So I think all of those things really come together and gave me the confidence to say, let's be ourselves. And a whole bunch of other things, right? Barry Jenkins makes a movie. That's like, you know what, we're just going to tell this story about this kid in Miami. Right. And so all these other different influences at the time is all happening at the same time that coalesced to help me, give me the confidence to hone my skills, my writing skills in that sense.
I have so much I want to say, but I want you to have the last word. We got 4 minutes, maybe 3. Is there is there like what's the thing you want folks to take away? I mean, I know there are a lot, but if you could give us something to put in our pocket, what's the things you want? What's a thing that you want folks to take away from getting something to eat?
That Blackness is beautifully diverse, and we have to pay attention to that, right? So I'm pivoting. My next project stays really in the same vein, but I'm moving away again, right? I'm not writing about the Bronx no more. I'm not writing about Mississippi no more. It's a little bit biographical. I'm writing about myself and writing about the experience of African immigrants. And the thing that moves me the most is try to think about, let's explore different diversity of Blackness. What do immigrants add to the story of Blackness in America, right? And, lucky enough to have spent my sabbatical out of the country in France. The thing that blew me away, that made me feel like Europe is ours too, is that Black folks have been there and building that too, right? So I think for me, the biggest takeaway out of this project and hopefully everything I ever do in my career is that let's talk about all the crooks and crannies about what it means to be Black, the joys of it, the pains of it, the things we produce, the things that we do refuse to do, the way we fight with each other, all those kinds of things are, for me, unendingly interesting. And on top of it, it will sharpen every theoretical concept we have in our discipline if we continue to study Blackness in its most diverse sense.
You've got some students in the Q&A who speak highly of you or former student. Excited to read the book. You've got a couple of questions about your, despite this not being exactly a food book, did you eat anything particularly tasty? And then there's another question about
pig-ear sandwiches in Jackson, Mississippi. If you ever get to Jackson, that's the thing that I ate that I'm like, I don't know if I want to eat this again, but I'm glad that I did. I think being in Mississippi taught me how to drink bourbon.
Hey, and on that note, hey brother, I appreciate it, man. This was love. I'm excited to read the book again. And excited for the world to get it. Get their hands on it. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh man, much love, brother. Thank you for doing this. Hillary, how'd we do?
You guys did wonderfully. This was incredible. Thank you so much to Professor Foster and ProfessorEwoodzie. Thanks to everybody out there who spent your evening with us. And you can learn more about this important book and purchase Getting Something to Eat in Jackson on harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night. Keep reading, and please,
Bobby Smith got a dope food coming out too, so look out for that.
Yes, look out for that. Harvard.com, if I may. So everybody, please stay well and keep reading. Thank you both so much.
Peace.
Y'all be good.